Hello, I'm Cara Dahl Russell, and I hope you're enjoying a beautiful spring as I am. This is being recorded in March of 2022, but this pre-concert lecture was first given in April of 2018 for the Mid-Atlantic Symphony Orchestra regarding the Egmont Overture of Ludwig van Beethoven, who lived from 1770 to 1827. Now, as you will know, if you've watched some of my other pre-concert lectures, when I'm giving these lectures, I'm talking about the whole program, and so I'm usually looking for unifying themes that go between the pieces and link the pieces together. There is always some sort of unifying theme in the mind of the conductor when he's putting the program together, and I don't go by that. I go by what I see in the pieces, and so I can bring an extra level of thought and understanding to the combination of the pieces. This was on a program with Mozart's Piano Concerto number 12 and Gustav Mahler's Symphony number 4. So the musical selections in that program gave me the opportunity to talk about the symbiosis between the technical work of a musician and the emotional life of the musician. So intellect, heart, sense, and sensibility. We have a long-standing attitude, especially here in America, that musicians are just creatures of emotions and primal drives who are pouring out their blood and sweat with every performance and every composition, erupting in a lava flow of scalding hot inspiration. And we love this idea. And we often really resist and even resent being called away from that idea. We admire credentials, but we just love thinking that it requires no work, no training, and little practice. It just springs fully formed, and this thrills us. And it's why it's so convenient to detest critics. Critics remind us of distracting things. For example, the fact that every song a singer-songwriter wrote kind of sounds the same. Or they are well versed enough in the improvisations of an instrumentalist to know that when we think that person is doing something brand new, and when their so-called improvisation drove the audience wild, that it's the same thing they played last week. So it's not really an improvisation anymore, but it's now more of a practiced composition. And we scream back at these critics. We don't care about that because we love them and we love this piece. And we're often very defensive about our own personal star. And deep down, we feel somehow perhaps a little cheated by knowing that the artist has an interplay between the emotion of the moment and the technical concern of repeating the performance that they recorded last year. Or the artist chooses to diverge from the recording and knows a segment of the audience really only wants to hear it duplicated the way that it was played before and recorded. So if we can put on our mature adult hats before we listen to music, and you're listening to this today because you're ready to be an adult and you're listening, then we are ready to discuss this interplay between inspiration and technical engineering in what we're about to hear. How fortunate, then, that we're starting with Beethoven. Beethoven is a really good touchstone to begin with because his music often appeals in a very direct way to our emotions, but he's a composer who can be pointed to as keeping his emotions very separate from his compositions. And Beethoven was very emotional. We know from his letters and from his writings and the writings of his friends and his co-workers that he would often have huge rifts with a friend over something, sometimes insignificant disagreements, and he would break off with them entirely and literally write them a letter and write them off. A heated emotional letter saying he never wants to see them again. Then months would pass by, and he'd write a letter just oozing with heart-wrenching affection. Now, letters of this period were truly romantic, even between friends, so the hearts and flowers spilled forth, and uniformly, his friends forgave him and came back. So this says something about Beethoven's friendship, that people put up with these tantrums and then they returned. In his letter writing, in his interactions, he was very emotionally present. And it can be wearing to have a friend or family member who is constantly fully feeling the fleeting emotions of every moment. It was somewhat more forgivable then because that was the zeitgeist of the Romantic era. But while he is fully feeling and living this emotional turmoil in his interactions and his letters, his music remained set apart, a thing with a life of its own and its own distinct emotions. In short, the technical concern of giving life to a valid work was separate from his own daily emotions. The best examples we have of this is when he was working on two things at once. And he often worked on his symphonies in pairs, one light and upbeat, the other dark and dramatic. And he kept these separate from each other and from his own emotions. Now, the exceptions that prove the rule are some of his piano sonatas that are smaller and very personal, a solo form of expression. There are a few of these that connect and display his feelings, sometimes intentionally because of a dedication. But even that is, of necessity, a very public expression of the emotion. If you listen to the piano sonatas that he dedicated to his great loves, these are the women whose names come up when people wonder about who was his immortal beloved in the note that he addressed to her. And I do have a video about that, and I'll link to that here, because I think that I've figured out who it is. You may come away with a clear musical portrait in those sonatas of the type of emotional bond that he had with each one of them, from tempestuous to playful to almost religious to compassionate and comfortable. And yet, as I said, those are the exceptions to the rule. For the most part, however emotionally stirring the work Beethoven wrote, it was an artistically technical thing that was set aside from his emotional life. Now today, the piece that we're going to hear was a piece written on commission for an historically based play by Goethe. Beethoven was near 40. He was established as a great German composer, working on a piece by the great German poet and writer Goethe. So we can expect nationalism and patriotism to run high in this work, both through the story and the people telling the story. Beethoven was hired to write incidental music for this play, and incidental music can be quite extensive, because we were still in a time period where a night at the theater, especially serious plays, could last up to 4 hours. Sometimes now an orchestra will record the entire incidental music to a now obscure play, and it will often have to be a 2 CD set. We're going to hear the overture today to Egmont. Very shortly after the production of the play, the overture became a standalone work, and it has remained in concert lineup since then. Music critic Milton Cross noted that we must remember that Beethoven's overtures are dramas in miniature. This is why they stand alone so well. They musically tell the story in advance in a condensed way, which is what we have now come to expect from an overture. The story of Egmont is the story of the liberator of his people, a hero of the Netherlands who fought against Spanish domination. Okay, so we have Netherlands and Spain Why such a big deal in the Germany of Goethe and Beethoven? Quite simply, because this was a time of the consolidation of Germany and revolution amongst all the many small kingdoms within Germany. A small historical note, which you can explore: Germany was the most fractured of the European countries and regions. It had to do with their political structure and how it was reflected in how lands were granted since medieval times. So by the time we get to the 1800s, even the smallest of regions could be under hot contest by a number of rulers fighting over their perceived rightful inheritance. This is why the unification of Germany took longer than almost every other country in Europe, and why it is still being discussed and acted on by Hitler and his contemporaries as a concept in the 1900s. National unification is what they called it. So back to our music. Egmont, the hero, the play, acted as a surrogate in some ways for the political events of the day. And that's probably part of why the play disappeared fairly quickly and the incidental music went with it. Politics at the moment fade. What remains is the stirring overture, a distillation of occupation, conflict, upheaval, and heroic success. Now, if you know anything about Beethoven, you know that these are themes that he returns to time and time again. And this work came to him at a time when he was fully aware of and dealing with his hearing loss. So not only did he have these large political constructs that he felt very strongly about, but on his personal scale, he very much felt himself to be a hero struggling against patrons and society who were judging him, and against something internally, physically insurmountable. So here we have technical elements, a work written on an historical story pretext that resonates with the politics of the day, that raises larger political concepts that have a personal significance for the composer, who happens to be one of the greatest composers of all times. And I'll have a link here to a performance of it. And in the text below, I'll have links to other performances, perhaps in different musical groupings, so that you can compare and contrast them. So as you listen to it, feel free to be swept away on all of those various waves of emotion. Enjoy Beethoven's Egmont Overture. Thank you.